The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipped through the mail slot like a knife between ribs. Victoria Prescott didn't need to open it to know what it was. The cream-colored envelope, the embossed gold seal, the weight of 15 years pressed into cardstock. Her hands trembled as she held it, standing in her architecture firm's corner office, surrounded by awards that suddenly felt like set pieces in an elaborate performance. Ridgemont High School class of 2009. 15-year reunion. 15 years since she'd walked those halls with dreams of designing buildings that would outlast her. 6 of those years she'd spent married to Philip Lawson, watching him systematically dismantle those dreams with surgical precision disguised as love. 5 years since the divorce that left her with nothing but the clothes she wore and a restraining order she'd never told anyone about. But that wasn't the whole truth, was it? 2 years she'd spent crawling out of the wreckage. 3 years she'd been married to Gregory Prescott, a man who'd confessed to being a vampire king before their second date, who'd offered her radical honesty when Philip had only ever given her calculated lies. She'd rebuilt everything. Founded Sanctuary Designs. Won the Design Ledger Innovation Award. Created spaces where abuse survivors could finally breathe. So, why did this invitation make her feel like she was suffocating? Because Philip would be there. And part of her still believed every word he'd ever said about her worthlessness. The reunion wasn't the danger. Seeing Philip again was. And what he planned to do in front of everyone could destroy everything she rebuilt. Before we continue, let me know in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe because tomorrow I have something extra special saved just for you, and you won't want to miss it. Now, let's continue. Victoria placed the invitation on her desk, hands still shaking. She had to go. She had to know if she'd truly survived, or if she'd simply learned to pretend. The invitation sat on her desk for 3 days before Gregory noticed. Victoria had been staying late at the office, pretending to review blueprints for the new women's shelter in Portland. Sanctuary Designs had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. 7 projects across 4 states, each one a testament to the belief that architecture could be armor. Load-bearing walls thick enough to muffle screaming. Windows positioned to catch sunrise, reminding residents that darkness always ended. Kitchens designed for community, not isolation. The Design Ledger had called her work revolutionary empathy in concrete form. The feature article sat framed in her reception area, proof that she'd become someone who mattered. Yet Philip's voice still lived in her skull, like a parasite. "You're not talented, just stubborn. You'll never make it without me." She was staring at the Portland blueprints without seeing them when the temperature in her office dropped. Not dramatically. Gregory had learned subtlety over centuries, but enough that her breath misted slightly in the warm October air. "This is the 3rd night you've stayed past midnight." His voice carried no accusation, only observation. He stood in her doorway, platinum hair catching the streetlight through her window, looking like something out of a pre-Raphaelite painting. Preternatural, patient, immortal in a way that should terrify her, but never had. Victoria gestured at the invitation without looking up. Ridgemont. 15 years. Gregory crossed the room with that particular silence only apex predators possessed and picked up the cream-colored card. He read it without expression, then set it down precisely where he'd found it. And no judgment. No directive. He'd promised her autonomy on their second date, right after confessing he'd been alive since the French Revolution. He'd kept that promise for 3 years. He'll be there. She finally met Gregory's eyes, ancient and amber and entirely focused on her. Philip, with his new wife, probably, and everyone we went to school with. "Do you want to attend?" The question was so carefully neutral it made her throat tight. Gregory could dismantle Philip with a phone call. Could have him investigated, audited, destroyed before breakfast. He could certainly accompany her to a high school reunion and make Philip feel like the insect he was. But that wasn't what she needed. "I have to go alone," Victoria said, the words tasting like failure and freedom simultaneously. "I need to prove that I'm real. That everything I've built isn't just borrowed from your strength." Gregory's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. Understanding, perhaps. Or recognition. He didn't tell her what to do. He never did. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. "What do you need?" The words stuck in her throat. She needed to face Philip alone. Needed to prove that sanctuary designs, the awards, the woman staring back from her office window, all of it was real. She needed to know if her recovery was genuine or just expensive camouflage. "I don't know yet," she whispered. Gregory nodded once, ancient and patient, and understood completely. The invitation remained on her desk, waiting. The gown arrived from the boutique on Friday afternoon, midnight blue silk that caught light like deep water. Victoria had spent 2 hours selecting it online, rejecting anything remotely beige or cream or that particular shade of pale pink Philip used to buy her. "Soft colors suit you better," he'd say, which really meant, "Don't draw attention. Don't outshine me. Disappear into the background where you belong." This dress didn't disappear. It commanded. She laid it across her bed Saturday morning, smoothing invisible wrinkles with hands that had learned to stop shaking. Preparation felt like armor construction, each decision deliberate, tactical. The sleeveless cut showed shoulders she'd rebuilt in yoga classes during those 2 years of crawling back to herself. The elegant drape suggested power, without apology. Her reflection in the full-length mirror showed someone she almost believed in. Victoria twisted her blonde hair into a refined low bun, architectural in its precision. Professional. Intentional. Nothing like the loose waves Philip preferred, the ones that made her look younger, softer, easier to diminish. She'd worn her hair down for 6 years of marriage, even though she hated it falling in her face while drafting. Every pin she secured felt like reclaiming territory. The woman staring back looked like someone who'd won awards, who designed spaces that sheltered the broken, who'd married a vampire king and somehow survived both that revelation and the marriage itself. The design ledger's cover story had used words like visionary and transformative. Standing here in midnight blue, Victoria could almost see that woman in her reflection. Almost. "You'll devastate him." Gregory's voice came from the doorway, soft as falling snow. She hadn't heard him approach, she never did. He leaned against the frame in dark slacks and an untucked shirt, platinum hair loose around his shoulders, looking simultaneously timeless and catastrophically beautiful. His ancient eyes held something that might have been pride. "I don't want to devastate him," Victoria said, though her hands trembled slightly as she fastened her earrings. "I just want to stop hearing his voice in my head." Gregory crossed the room with that preternatural silence, stopping just behind her. Their eyes met in the mirror, hers uncertain, his steady as stone. "You rebuilt yourself before you met me," he said quietly. "I simply gave you space to continue." The words should have comforted her. She knew them intellectually, could trace the timeline, clawing back her architectural license, the first shelter commission, founding Sanctuary Designs. All of it before Gregory walked into her life and casually mentioned he'd been alive since Marie Antoinette. But knowing something intellectually and believing it emotionally were different architectures entirely. What if you're wrong? The question escaped before she could stop it. What if Philip sees through everything? What if I'm just? You're not. How do you know? His reflection smiled, sad and ancient. Because pretenders don't spend 3 years designing buildings to save people they'll never meet. Victoria looked at herself again. Midnight blue. Low bun. The woman who'd survived Philip and divorce and 2 years of rebuilding in obscurity. She was terrified that woman was still just a costume. But she was going to that reunion anyway. The Grandstone Ballroom hadn't changed in 15 years. Victoria stood in the arched entrance, taking in the polished, checkered marble floors that stretched toward floor-to-ceiling windows draped in gold silk. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across faces she half remembered. Older now, softer around the edges, but still wearing the same social hierarchies they'd perfected in high school. The stage at the far end gleamed under spotlights. She'd stood there once, 17 and hopeful, accepting the architecture department award while her parents beamed from the third row. That girl had believed buildings could change the world. That girl had never met Philip Lawson. Now the ballroom felt less like a celebration and more like a courtroom awaiting verdict. Victoria? A woman in emerald green approached, smile bright and calculating. "Oh my God, you look amazing. I heard you, well, we heard." She gestured vaguely, fishing. "I run an architecture firm," Victoria said evenly. "Sanctuary Designs. We specialize in trauma-informed shelter spaces." Right. The woman's eyes flickered with something Victoria couldn't quite read. "And you remarried?" "Someone in tech." The whispers had already started. She could feel them like humidity against her skin. "That's Victoria Prescott now. Married that billionaire. What does he even do?" "I heard her ex-husband says she." Victoria moved deeper into the ballroom with the same precision she used drafting blueprints, measuring sight lines, identifying exits, calculating angles of approach. The crowd parted slightly as she passed, conversations pausing just long enough to feel deliberate. She accepted sparkling water from a passing server, positioned herself near a marble column that offered strategic cover, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Then she saw him. Philip stood near the bar in a crisp black tuxedo, dark beard trimmed to corporate perfection, holding court with a cluster of former football players who'd grown thick around the middle. He looked successful, confident, exactly like the man who'd convinced her she was worthless. He was laughing at something, head thrown back, when he shifted slightly to the left. That's when Victoria saw her. The young woman stood just behind Philip's shoulder, mid-20s at most, in a pale pink dress that washed out her already colorless complexion. She held a glass of white wine she wasn't drinking, smile fixed in place like it had been pinned there. Her eyes, light brown, exhausted, tracked Philip's movements with a hypervigilance of someone perpetually calculating mood shifts. Victoria knew those eyes, had seen them in her own mirror for 6 years. Empty, watchful, disappearing. Philip's new wife. Victoria's stomach dropped so violently she had to grip the marble column for balance. The ballroom tilted. 15 years collapsed into this single moment, past and present overlapping like architectural transparencies, showing her exactly what she'd escaped and exactly what this girl was still trapped inside. Philip hadn't changed. He'd just found a younger version of the woman he'd already destroyed. The girl's gaze flickered across the room and landed on Victoria. For one suspended second, their eyes met. Recognition passed between them like a current. Then Philip turned, following his wife's stare, and saw Victoria standing there in midnight blue. His smile sharpened into something predatory. He was already moving toward her. Philip crossed the ballroom like he owned it, that familiar smug grin spreading across his face, the exact expression that used to come right before he'd eviscerate her self-worth while pretending to care. Victoria. Her name in his mouth felt like a violation. "You look expensive." The word hung in the air, dripping with implication. Not beautiful, not elegant. Expensive, like she was an acquisition, a purchase, something bought rather than earned. Philip. She forced her voice to stay level. It's been a while. 5 years. He stopped just inside her personal space, close enough that she could smell his cologne, the same brand, still. This is Bethany. He gestured casually to the young woman hovering at his elbow. My wife. Bethany extended a hand with the mechanical precision of someone following a script. Nice to meet you. Her voice was barely audible, eyes fixed somewhere around Victoria's collarbone. Bethany works in my firm now, Philip continued, not waiting for Victoria to respond. Administrative support. She's wonderful at it, very detail-oriented. Knows her place in the operation. The emphasis was surgical. Victoria's throat constricted. Knows her place. Jesus Christ, he was still using the same playbook. So, Philip's smile widened. Still doing that architecture thing? What was it, designing houses? Shelters, Victoria corrected quietly. For abuse survivors. Right. Shelters. He said it like she'd claimed to be building rocket ships. That's still going? I'm impressed. I honestly thought you'd have accepted by now that some dreams are just hobbies. Things we tell ourselves we're passionate about before we grow up. A few former classmates had drifted closer, drawn by the spectacle. Victoria recognized Brad Morrison, Jessica Dave, others whose names escaped her. They formed a loose circle, watching. Sanctuary Designs has completed 7 projects across 4 states, Victoria said, hating how defensive she sounded. Philip's eyebrows rose in exaggerated surprise. 7. That's amazing. And your husband, Gregory, is it? He must be so supportive. What does he do again? Some kind of venture capital. The trap was so familiar she could have drawn its blueprints. Whatever she said, Philip would twist it. If she downplayed Gregory's wealth, Philip would paint her as ashamed. If she acknowledged it, he'd suggest she'd married for money. He's in private investment, she managed. Private investment. Philip nodded thoughtfully, that concerned ex-husband mask sliding into place. That's wonderful, Victoria. Really? I just worry sometimes that you've lost yourself a bit. You were always so independent, so determined to make it on your own. And now, well, I'm sure the shelters are meaningful, but we both know that kind of work doesn't really sustain itself financially. Does it? The old paralysis crept through Victoria's limbs like ice water. This was how it always worked. Philip never attacked directly. He positioned himself as worried, as caring, as the only person honest enough to voice difficult truths. Other classmates shifted uncomfortably. A few nodded slightly, buying the performance. The firm is profitable, Victoria said, but the words felt hollow. Of course. Philip's hand moved to Bethany's lower back, possessive. I'm just saying, there's no shame in accepting help. In admitting that maybe you needed someone to facilitate your dreams. Some of us are builders. Some of us need builders. His smile was poison wrapped in concern. You always were stubborn about accepting reality. You're not talented, just stubborn. The voice in her head was his. Had always been his. Victoria felt herself drowning in the middle of the grandstone ballroom, surrounded by people, unable to breathe. Bethany's empty eyes met hers again. And Victoria saw herself, 6 years ago, standing in exactly the same place. The clinking of glass against crystal silenced the ballroom 20 minutes later. Victoria had retreated to the far corner near the windows, trying to regulate her breathing, when Philip's voice cut through the ambient noise. If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment. He stood near the stage, microphone in hand, smile warm and self-deprecating. I know we're all here to reconnect, to celebrate how far we've come since Ridgemont. And I wanted to take a second to toast old friends and second chances. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Victoria's chest tightened. 15 years is a long time, Philip continued, his tone conversational, relatable. Long enough to become completely different people. Long enough to look back at who we were and barely recognize ourselves. He paused, letting the words settle. Sometimes that's beautiful. Growth is beautiful. But sometimes, and I think we've all seen this, sometimes people don't actually grow. They just trade one costume for another. A few uncomfortable laughs. Victoria's hands went cold. I've been thinking a lot lately about authenticity, Philip said, warming to his theme. About people who abandon their authentic selves because the work of building something real is too hard, too slow, too uncertain. His eyes swept the room, carefully avoiding Victoria while making it clear exactly who he meant. We live in a world now where it's easier to play dress up in someone else's success than to build your own, where you can just attach yourself to someone else's foundation and call it achievement. The silence in the ballroom shifted from polite to uncomfortable. Several former classmates glanced toward Victoria. She felt their eyes like brands. I'm not judging, Philip said quickly, his expression pained, like this confession cost him something. God knows I tried to support people who chose that path. I was married once to someone I believed in completely, someone I thought had genuine passion, genuine talent. I encouraged her architecture dreams, supported her through school, through every failed interview, every rejection letter. He shook his head sadly. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, if someone couldn't make it on their own after years of trying, is the dream actually real? Or is it just pretend? Victoria stopped breathing. And when that person suddenly has all the success they claim to want, but only after marrying someone with the money to make it happen, well. Philip's smile was gentle, forgiving. You have to wonder if you're watching someone finally achieve their dreams, or if you're watching someone play pretend in a very expensive costume. A few heads nodded. Brad Morrison looked thoughtful. Jessica Dave's mouth tightened in what might have been sympathy for Philip. Some people are builders, Philip continued, his voice carrying absolute certainty. They do the hard work, take the risks, build from nothing. And some people, they find builders. They find someone to facilitate the fantasy, to bankroll the performance. He raised his glass. There's no shame in it, really. It's just important to be honest about what you are. The room filled with scattered, uncertain applause. Philip's gaze finally landed on Victoria, just for a second, and his expression held something that looked like pity. To authenticity, he said, and to old friends who deserve the truth. Glasses raised. People drank. Victoria felt her carefully constructed identity crumbling like condemned architecture. Every award, every completed shelter, every design journal feature, suddenly they all felt like props. Evidence of performance rather than substance. What if she'd never actually rebuilt herself at all, just found someone wealthy enough to construct a convincing disguise? The ballroom spun. Bethany watched her from across the room, those empty eyes full of something that might have been recognition or warning. Victoria couldn't tell anymore. She couldn't tell anything anymore except that Philip had just destroyed her in front of everyone, and part of her believed he was right to do it. Victoria's vision narrowed to a pinpoint. The ballroom became a blur of gold and crystal and faces she no longer recognized. Sound reached her through water, muffled applause, scattered conversation resuming, the clink of glasses being refilled. Philip's voice still echoed in her skull like a diagnosis she'd always suspected, but never wanted confirmed. Playing dress-up in someone else's success. Her hands trembled so violently she had to clasp them together. The midnight blue gown that had felt like armor 2 hours ago now felt like a costume. Evidence. Proof of everything Philip had just said. She'd built sanctuary designs. 7 shelters. 4 states. She had the contracts, the architectural plans bearing her signature, the design ledger feature in her reception area. But Philip had funded her education, had paid rent while she studied, had positioned himself as the foundation she'd built on, and then removed himself to watch everything collapse. What if Gregory was just another foundation? What if she was still the same woman, just with a wealthier support system? The checkered marble floor tilted beneath her feet. Victoria reached for the nearest column, fingers pressing against cold stone, trying to anchor herself to something solid. Her breath came shallow and fast, the beginning of panic she recognized from those first months after the divorce, when she'd wake at 3 a.m. convinced she was worthless. Across the ballroom, Bethany stood motionless near Philip, her pale pink dress and empty eyes screaming everything Victoria had felt for 6 years. Their gazes locked, and Victoria saw something desperate flash across the younger woman's face. Recognition. Pleading. A silent scream that said, "Don't leave me here alone with him. Don't prove that escape is impossible." But Victoria couldn't save her. Couldn't even save herself. She was drowning in the middle of the grandstone ballroom, surrounded by 200 people, and no one was reaching for her. Some were nodding in agreement with Philip's character assassination. Others looked uncomfortable but silent, complicit through inaction. Brad Morrison whispered something to the man beside him. Jessica Dave shook her head slowly, expression unreadable. A woman Victoria vaguely remembered from AP English raised her glass toward Philip in solidarity. The whispers intensified, no longer bothering with discretion. Always thought she was ambitious, but I guess. Philip really dodged a bullet there. Heard the new husband is never around, probably knows what she. My cousin worked with her firm, said everything runs through some trust fund. Each word was a brick added to the wall Philip had built around her, trapping her inside the narrative he'd constructed. The talented husband, the delusional wife, the inevitable failure, the wealthy rescue that proved she'd never been real. Victoria took one step toward the exit, then another. Her architectural training tried to kick in, measure the distance, calculate the route, identify the cleanest escape, but all she could think was run. Get out. Disappear. Prove Philip right by fleeing. Prove that she was never strong enough to face him. Prove that everything she'd built was just expensive set design around a hollow core. Prove that the woman who'd stood on that stage 15 years ago accepting architecture awards had been a fantasy, and this humiliation was the truth. Her heel clicked against marble. The arched entrance was 20 feet away. 15 feet. Bethany's eyes tracked her movement, filling with something that looked like abandonment. 10 feet. Philip was laughing at something near the bar, his performance complete, his victory secured. 5 feet. Then the ballroom doors opened. The temperature dropped so suddenly that conversation stopped mid-sentence. Not gradually, instantly, like someone had opened a door to winter. Breath misted in the air. The chandeliers seemed to dim, though the bulbs didn't change. The very oxygen felt thinner, sharper. Every head turned toward the entrance. Victoria froze, one foot still pointed toward escape, and felt the air itself shift into something electric and dangerous. She knew what that cold meant. Had felt it in her office 3 nights ago, in their bedroom 1,000 mornings, in every space Gregory occupied when his careful human mask slipped just slightly. The silence that fell over the grandstone ballroom wasn't polite or uncomfortable. It was primal. The kind of silence that happened when something apex entered a room full of prey, and every instinct screamed the same message. Don't move. Don't breathe. Don't draw attention. Gregory Prescott entered like a force of nature contained in human form. Tall, easily 6'3", and regal in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with presence. His skin was porcelain pale, the kind of white that didn't exist naturally, that caught the chandelier light and reflected it back like moonlight on snow. Platinum blonde hair flowed past his shoulders in a way that should have looked ridiculous on a man, but instead looked inevitable, like he'd been born from some pre-Raphaelite painting and simply stepped into the wrong century. He wore a black velvet suit jacket with intricate gold filigree embroidery tracing the lapels and cuffs, patterns that seemed to shimmer with their own light, catching the eye and holding it. Beneath, a black dress shirt, open at the collar. A gold watch that probably cost more than most people's cars glinted at his wrist. But it wasn't the clothes that stopped conversation. It was him. Something about Gregory Prescott wasn't quite human, wasn't quite right in a way that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the brainstem. The part of the human mind that still remembered what it felt like to be prey. The crowd parted without anyone consciously deciding to move. Bodies shifted, creating a corridor from the entrance to the center of the ballroom, and Gregory walked through it with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once in his long life doubted his right to command space. He didn't rush. Didn't need to. His eyes swept the room, cold, authoritative, the amber color of old whiskey or older gold, and Victoria knew he was cataloging everything. Every face. Every whispered conversation. Every person who'd nodded along with Philip's character assassination. Gregory had lived through the French Revolution, had watched empires rise and collapse, had seen centuries of humans doing exactly what they were doing now, destroying each other with words because they'd learned to fear the consequences of violence. He found Victoria in 3 seconds. His gaze locked on her, still frozen 5 feet from the exit, hands trembling, eyes wet with tears she refused to let fall, and something shifted in his expression. Not softening, exactly, but sharpening, focusing. He crossed the ballroom in silence, every step deliberate, and stopped directly in front of her. Philip didn't exist. Brad Morrison didn't exist. The 200 former classmates watching this unfold didn't exist. There was only Victoria, shaking like she might shatter, and Gregory, who looked at her like she was the only person in the room worth seeing. "Are you well?" His voice was low, pitched for her alone, but it carried in the absolute silence. Victoria opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She was shaking so hard her teeth nearly chattered. Gregory's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, just a fraction of movement, but she saw it. Saw the moment he understood exactly what had happened. Saw the cold fury that flickered through his ancient eyes before he locked it down behind centuries of practiced control. He didn't touch her, didn't pull her into his arms or make a scene. Instead, he simply stood there, a wall between her and the room, and asked again, "Victoria, are you well?" "No," she whispered. His eyes flickered to something over her shoulder. Philip, probably, still standing near the bar, and when he looked back at her, his expression was gentle in a way that somehow made him more terrifying. "Would you like me to handle this?" he asked quietly. Every instinct screamed yes. Let Gregory dismantle Philip the way only an immortal predator could. Let him destroy the man who'd spent 15 minutes destroying her. But that was the problem, wasn't it? If Gregory fought this battle, Philip would be right. She would be someone playing dress-up in someone else's power. "I don't know," Victoria breathed. Gregory nodded once. Understood completely. Then he turned to face the room. Gregory turned to face Philip with a kind of deliberate movement that made the entire ballroom hold its breath. Philip stood near the bar, still holding court, his smug grin faltering slightly as he registered the shift in atmosphere. Next to Gregory's preternatural stillness, Philip looked suddenly, viscerally small. An ordinary man in an ordinary tuxedo who'd mistaken a high school reunion for a kingdom he still ruled. Gregory didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. When he spoke, Every person in the Grandstone Ballroom listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for hearing test results or verdict readings. Philip Lawson. Not a question. A statement. An identification. Philip's grin solidified into something more defensive. I'm sorry, do I know you?
No.
Gregory's tone was conversational, almost pleasant. But I know you. I know, for instance, that Victoria founded Sanctuary Designs in 2019 with a startup loan from the Athern Foundation, a competitive grant she applied for and won independently 18 months before we met. I know her firm generated $2.3 million in revenue last year, 70% of which came from municipal contracts and nonprofit partnerships that have nothing to do with my investments. The room shifted. Whispers died. I know she won the Design Ledger Innovation Award in 2022 based on peer review by a panel of 12 architects, none of whom I've ever met or influenced. I know her Portland shelter design is currently being considered for the National AIA Architecture Prize. Gregory's amber eyes never left Philip's face. I know these things because I pay attention to my wife's accomplishments, the way a partner should. Philip's face began to redden. Look, I don't know what Victoria told you. I also know other things. Gregory's voice dropped half a degree. Still conversational. Still pleasant. But something underneath it made several people step back instinctively. I know that between 2019 and 2021, you contacted Victoria 47 times despite a restraining order explicitly forbidding contact. I know you showed up at her first shelter opening and had to be removed by security. I know you told her former colleagues she'd plagiarized her thesis work, a claim investigated and dismissed by Ridgemont's academic board. The blood drained from Philip's face as quickly as it had flooded in. I know that you're currently under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for misappropriating client funds from your investment firm. The formal inquiry began 6 weeks ago. I know your assets have been frozen pending audit, and I know that 3 former clients have filed civil suits alleging fraud. Gregory tilted his head slightly. I know these things because they're matters of public record, easily discoverable by anyone who bothers to look. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Philip's mouth opened. Closed. His smug grin had crumbled entirely into something closer to panic. Those are allegations. You can't just... I can present documentation if you'd prefer, Gregory said mildly. I brought copies. Bethany had gone pale as paper, staring at her husband like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. Brad Morrison looked at the floor. Jessica Day's expression had shifted from sympathetic to horrified. The woman who'd toasted Philip earlier was suddenly very interested in her phone. The room had turned. Completely. The man who'd stood on stage painting himself as the hard-working victim was now exposed as exactly what he'd always been, a predator who destroyed women and called it love. Gregory could have finished him, could have twisted the blade, reduced Philip to nothing in front of everyone he'd ever wanted to impress. Instead, he stepped aside. However, Gregory said quietly, his ancient eyes moving from Philip back to Victoria, this is not my story to tell. He extended his hand toward her, an offering, not a demand. It's hers. The ballroom waited. Victoria stood 5 feet from the exit, shaking, tears finally streaking her carefully applied makeup, staring at Gregory's outstretched hand. She could take it. Let him finish this. Let the vampire king destroy the man who destroyed her. Or she could step forward and speak for herself. Prove that her voice had always been her own. She'd just forgotten how to use it. Her hand moved before her mind fully caught up. She took Gregory's hand and stepped into the center of the ballroom. Victoria's hand felt steady in Gregory's for the first time all night. She stepped forward into the center of the ballroom, into the space Philip had tried to turn into her execution ground, and for a long moment, She just stood there. 200 faces watched her with varying degrees of curiosity, discomfort, and shame. She didn't look at Philip, didn't waste another second of her life acknowledging him. Instead, she looked directly at Bethany. The young woman stood frozen near the bar, pale pink dress and empty eyes, holding a glass of wine like a prop in someone else's play. When their gazes met, Bethany flinched, but didn't look away. "I don't know you," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying in the absolute silence. "But I know exactly who you are. Because I was you." Bethany's breath hitched. 6 years, Victoria continued. "That's how long I was married to Philip. 6 years of him telling me my architecture dreams were cute but unrealistic. 6 years of him funding my education while reminding me I'd never make it without him. 6 years of concern that was actually isolation. Advice that was actually sabotage. Love that was actually systematic dismantling of everything I thought I was." The ballroom had gone so quiet Victoria could hear her own heartbeat. "He told me I wasn't talented, just stubborn. That I should be grateful he tolerated my hobbies. That real architects didn't need their husbands to support them, which meant I wasn't real." Her voice didn't shake. "Not anymore. He chose my clothes, my friends, the color I painted our bedroom. And he did it all so gently, so lovingly, that I thought I was lucky. Thought I was the problem for not appreciating him." Bethany's eyes were filling with tears. "When I finally left, I had nothing. Not money, he'd made sure of that. Not references, he'd poisoned every professional connection I had. Not even my name felt like mine anymore." Victoria took a breath. "It took me 2 years to claw my way back. 2 years of working jobs I was overqualified for, sleeping in a studio apartment that cost more than I could afford, wondering if Philip was right. If I was just playing pretend." She could feel Gregory's presence behind her, solid, patient, letting her speak. "I still wonder sometimes," Victoria admitted. "I've won awards, built shelters, founded a firm that employs 17 people. And I still hear his voice telling me it's not real." Philip opened his mouth to speak. Gregory's gaze cut to him with predatory precision, and Philip's jaw snapped shut like he'd been physically struck. Victoria reached into her clutch and pulled out a business card. She walked directly to Bethany and pressed it into her hand. "When you're ready," Victoria said softly, holding the younger woman's terrified gaze. "Not if, when. Call me. I will help you. I will believe you. I will make sure you don't spend 2 years rebuilding alone." Bethany's fingers closed around the card. A single tear tracked down her cheek. Victoria stepped back, turned, and took Gregory's hand again. Not as rescue. Not as salvation. As partnership between equals who'd chosen each other honestly. They walked toward the exit together. Behind them, someone started clapping. Then another person. Then another. Applause built like a wave, some genuine, some guilty, some simply relieved the tension had broken. Victoria didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge it. She'd spent too many years performing for people who didn't matter. She didn't need their validation now. She'd needed only to speak, to reclaim her voice, to use it not for defense, but for offering the lifeline no one had given her. The night air hit her face as they stepped outside the grandstone ballroom. Cold, clear, free. Above them, stars scattered across the October sky, the same stars Gregory had watched for over 2 centuries, unchanging witnesses to human cruelty and human resilience. Victoria breathed deeply, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since the invitation arrived. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. Gregory looked down at her, platinum hair catching starlight, ancient eyes impossibly gentle. "Thank you for not needing me to," he replied. Victoria smiled. Actually smiled. Not the careful, professional expression she'd perfected for client meetings or award ceremonies. A real smile that came from somewhere deep and newly freed. For the first time in 15 years, since before she'd ever met Philip Lawson, before she'd learned what it meant to be systematically destroyed by someone who claimed to love you, Victoria Prescott believed she was genuinely free. Not because a vampire king had defended her, but because she'd finally defended herself, and offered that defense to someone else who desperately needed to know escape was possible. Behind them, the ballroom doors remained open. Music resumed. Life continued. But Victoria was already gone, walking toward the car with her husband's hand in hers, leaving Philip Lawson and his narrative in ruins. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. If this story reminded you that surviving isn't the same as thriving, that reclaiming your voice matters, please hit that like button. Subscribe so you never miss stories like this and share this video. Thanks for watching.